Welcome to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. I'm excited to be here with you all this morning or this afternoon or whatever time it is, wherever you're at in the world today. Um, Obviously, we're in wild times around the world. I won't say too much about that today, but we're here to talk about a very interesting struggle, very important struggle that's been going on in Kenya. And kind of the latest phase of it that we have seen with what I think in mainstream media has just kind of been a discussion about protests about a finance bill, probably, right? But a lot of us who are on social media have seen that there's a very intense struggle. And so we have someone who's coming on the show, has been on the show before on the audio side. There's a conversation that we had about breaking the silence on NGOs in Africa with the Kenya Organic Intellectuals Network. This young person, not this comrade, is a part of that group and a part of other groups. His name is Sungu Oyoo, and I'm going to let him say a little bit more about himself by way of introduction. But he is a writer coordinator from WAMCO, which is a Pan-African popular pedagogy collective. He's also the national spokesperson of the KLM, and I'll let him explain what that stands for, so that I don't mispronounce it. Wrote a really great piece that was republished in grassroots thinking, which is connected to community movement builders. And so, anyways, that's enough from me by way of introduction. I know that people are excited to hear from our guests. So, Sungu, I'll welcome you to the show. And yeah, so to start, let's just start giving you space to kind of introduce yourself a little bit more to our audience. Say a little bit about yourself and the organizations that you work with in Kenya. I know that you've been an organizer there for several years at least, and so it'd be, I think, good for folks to hear some of that background.
Thank you, Jared, and it's nice to be back on Millennials Are Killing Capitalism, and especially for this discussion about the ongoing protests in Kenya and the processes around that, which have in many ways been described as led by the Gen Z. And so it's interesting to be on this podcast named after millennials and discussing these protests led by the Gen Z. My name is Sungu Oyoo. Like Jared said, I'm a writer and an organizer. I organize basically on two main fronts. One, at Kongamano la Mapinduzi, which is a political movement in Kenya. Kongamano la Mapinduzi is Swahili for Congress of the Kongamano la Mapinduzi is Swahili for Congress of the Revolution. I'm also part of Muamco, which is a Pan-African popular pedagogy collective focusing mainly on political education, collective education processes, so as to enrich our struggles and help infuse more clarity into diverse organizing efforts going on. It's really nice to be back on the show.
It's great to have you. Great to be in conversation too about this, since I mean, we had a conversation with you all about your book, that you all contributed to, Breaking the Silence on NGOs in Africa, which, by the way, is a great text, and I encourage people to check it out and look at it as an example of, doing conjunctural analysis, organic intellectual work, and analyzing your own context. But we didn't really in that conversation get as much into some of the current events in Kenya, some of the struggles that you all were participating in. And so, I'm excited to do this with you. Hopefully on another time I can have some of the other comrades on to talk about it as well. But let's just give folks some background on these protests in Kenya against the finance bill. There's obviously a mass character to the mobilization, of the people that are dedicated to protesting, the willingness to confront state forces. All of these things stood out, I think, to folks who are paying attention. Can you say a little bit about some of the factors you think have brought the struggle to this point?
Um, I think at the eruption of these protests, the main question on the table was the punitive taxes, because the Ruto administration introduced a finance bill into parliament, and the finance bill basically outlines measures for revenue collection, basically how they are going to tax the people throughout the year so as to finance their budget. And it usually is presented, or it works in conjunction with the appropriations bill, which then is how that revenue collected is gonna be spent. And so, when the finance bill was introduced into Parliament, it proposed uh, a, a long range of really punitive taxes. So there was, for example, 16% value added tax on cooking oil, 16% value added tax on bread, taxes on sanitary towels, sanitary pads, and other sanitary items. A lot of taxes on basic commodities for a population which was already overtaxed and which was struggling with the high cost of living. And the population was struggling with the high cost of living, which is why the finance bill cannot be viewed in isolation. It was a culmination of a raft of really regressive taxation measures, which the administration has taken since coming into power in 2022. And so, less than a year earlier, sorry.
It's all right. Uh-oh, we lost him for a sec. I'm sure he'll be right back. We'll get him back. Good morning, everybody, while we're waiting. Good to see you. Good to see you. Wild times. Yes. All right. While we're giving Sungu a minute to get back in the studio, I'll just say quickly, we do have a conversation that's not yet up on the schedule. We're going to have a conversation with Slank and Musa Springer from Groundings podcast. On Tuesday, I believe it'll be at 5:30 p.m. Eastern or 6 p.m. Eastern. We're just finalizing the time. And we'll be discussing counterinsurgency through the arts and, the history of State Department, CIA, and, using artists as a kind of cultural front for their projects. And then we'll be talking, of course, about more probably benign, not maybe seemingly benign examples of that. And part of what brought this to the fore was folks have been paying attention. Chuck D has chosen to be a State Department ambassador, and so that was part of it. Anyway, Sungu is back, so welcome back, comrade. Sorry about that. Go ahead, continue with what you were saying.
I was saying, sorry about that. I was saying, since coming into power, the Ruto administration has continually imposed taxes on the Kenyan people. So you see, immediately after coming into power, they removed fuel subsidies, which raised the cost of transport across the country, which raised the cost of essential commodities across the country. The administration scrapped electricity. They raised electricity tariffs, basically raising cost of electricity by more than 200% a few months after coming to power. There was a review of the higher education program and government support towards it financially, and the cost of education in our universities and colleges has risen in the past 2 years. I think 4 times what people used to pay, more than 4 times. The cost of healthcare and access to healthcare. Our doctors have been on strike 2 months ago. They were on strike. I think the strike ended around 2 months ago. The doctors were on strike for a month. The clinical officers in the hospital were also on strike because the government was basically refused to pay them what they have been paid over the years. They were not even asking for more. They were saying, pay us and hire more doctors. There have been a range of issues happening, and I think these have been building up, and the finance bill was just the tipping point, or rather the point where the people said, no, we cannot continue in this fashion, because if we continue in this fashion, then this will be the death of us.
Thank you. Yeah, understood. So in the piece, you talk about kind of give a good narration of kind of the events of the protests themselves. Just quoting you quickly, you write that beyond being a protest, this was a festival of freedom that has inspired hope of future prospects and earthquakes in the political landscape, end quote. So I want to come back to that part, of course, and talk about where you think things will go, from here or could go from here. But before we get to that, I do want you to just kind of walk through you know, the days a bit for folks. The 18th, the 19th, the 20th. What happened on those days? How did the protesters mobilize? And what kind of attempts to either quell or appease or suppress these protests did they overcome?
Um, I think I might not remember the exact dates in which exact events happened, but I can at least give a narrative. And like I stated initially, these protests began as a protest against the finance bill, which has basically was very unpopular around the country. And the finance bill, like I said earlier, is it's not even a creation of the Kenyan government bureaucrats. It's a creation of the IMF as part of those conditionalities because of the loans that Kenya has taken from the IMF. And so the IMF had literally forced the Kenyan government to raise the taxation on the people, and the Kenyan government had agreed to those demands. And so when the bill was first introduced in the public domain, it was unpopular, and people said, no, we do not think we can pay this amount of taxes. We are basically gonna die, because in addition to the taxes I mentioned, income tax, for instance, is at 35% for most Kenyans, or at least on the higher brackets, and all taxes have been rising above board, and there is no services in return, and government officials are living lavish lifestyle. So what the population basically was saying was that instead of increasing the taxes, reduce unnecessary government expenditure, and the people called for a rejection of the finance bill. There was a protest around the 18th, I think, around the 18th of June in Nairobi, a very peaceful protest. People mobilized online and came on the street. And I think what then angered the people after that was that government bureaucrats and the political elite, basically the ruling class, came together either in the press or in functions and said, "These are Gen Z. This is a pampered generation. They're coming to the streets with their iPhones, and after that, they're gonna go to these posh restaurants and have coffee or have a meal and then go back home." And they said it in the open. And so people then showed up on the street again in larger numbers, in the hundreds of their thousands, to one, of course, voice their opposition to the bill, and second, to also claim their place in history, because throughout the history of Kenya, there has always been that struggle between the system and the people. It's what a writer called Shiraz Durrani referred to as the dialectic of repression and resistance. And so anytime that repression has always reached a peak, and in this instance, the level of economic violence had reached a peak, then resistance was the only point of the people safeguarding their existence as a people and their dignity as a people. And so people again showed up on the streets in larger numbers, and the protests had been really peaceful up to that point, until when On the second evening, I think the young people after the protests, the Kenyan people in the capital held a huge street party, and people were dancing and vibing to music and everything, and it was invaded by the police, who opened fire, and there we see the loss of life and several injuries. And so people then, of course, that whole festival of freedom is dispersed, because people had come out across ethnicity, across political parties, across gender, and even across sexuality, something which is very unusual in the Kenyan political sphere, because most of the protests and street actions are either led by the social movements and their membership, or by the political parties and their membership. And so this was really an uprising from below in very, very significant ways. And I think for the political class, for them, it was the moment when they sensed that they had lost the grip on the people in a very fundamental way. And so after the killing started, people, after the gathering was dispersed, people retreated back to their neighborhoods and again showed up in town, I think after 2 days or so. And on the 25th, this was, I think this is now around the 25th, when now things get heated, because even those who had not been part of the protests but who had been following, who are now angered by the events that they've seen either on television or on social media, all show up across the country. There were protests in different towns. It was not just Nairobi. I think in Kenya has 47 counties. There was protests in at least 35 of those counties. So at least 80% of the country witnessed massive protests. And in Nairobi on the 25th, the state, of course, unleashed its conveyor belts of violence, the police, on those who were protesting. And the people then pushed. And on this day, Parliament was again meeting to discuss. The finance bill was undergoing, I think, its third reading, if I'm not wrong. Yeah, its third reading, before it could then be passed and sent for presidential approval. And this whole time, Parliament had not listened to the people. The politicians from the ruling party kept insisting that we are going to pass this bill whether you like it or not, that you cannot try to interfere with government programs. And so I think the crowds got agitated and stormed their way into Parliament, which is supposed to be an institution which should safeguard, basically should be a safeguard of the people, but which has been turned into an instrument of the ruling class, has been weaponized and used as an instrument of oppression in this instance and in many previous instances. And in that process, a lot of young people from within the movements and outside the movements lost their lives. At least, I think on that particular day, at least 20 lives were lost, and it was brutal, because the young people, knowing that they had no recourse and that this was where this bill was being debated, they knew they had to stop it, and so they made their way there and scuttled that debate and then continued with their protests. What I think got the people to that point was this insistence, which I've just mentioned, by the ruling class, that we are going to pass this bill. The political class and the bureaucratic bourgeoisie, these people in our country and in many other countries produce nothing. The only thing they produce is misery, deprivation, humiliation, and death for our people. And our people are in the process of trying to create a society which is life affirming, a society where their dignity is assured, a society where freedom is assured. And so on the 25th, the president, that evening, the president then comes on the television, Ruto, and basically says this is an act of treason, these people are being influenced by whatnot and whatnot. But I think he had failed to read the mood in a significant way. But after a few days, he showed up. he showed up again on television and said, okay, I have conceded on this. We've listened to the voices of the people. And what we are going to do at this point is that we are dropping the finance bill. Late last week, he then, no, actually, it's a few days ago, not last week, this week, maybe 4 days ago, he then dissolved his cabinet because, okay, let me get to that point. He then dissolved his cabinet. And on the following day, the Inspector General of Police resigned. But I think what Ruto is doing is an exercise of self-preservation, because when his administration refused to listen to the people came on the street with a very simple demand: reject finance bill. They said, no, we can't reject it, we'll just amend it. People said, no, you can't amend something that's gonna kill us. You can't amend death. You reject death. And so I think on that part, he was completely out of touch with reality. His administration was completely out of touch with reality. And when the people realized that this administration was not listening to them, they then upped their call to a call of Ruto must go. And in saying Ruto must go, it was out of a realization that yes, the bill needs to go. Yes, Ruto needs to go, but Ruto himself is also a symptom of a larger problem. Ruto himself is a representation of a larger problem. He is a representation of the neo-colonial state and its workings. And in this instance, like in many other instances, the neo-colonial state is created in the image of the colonial state. It extracts, it humiliates, it every day subjugates our people. And so people were saying Ruto needs to go, Parliament needs to go, his cabinet needs to go. We need to create something anew. And when the protests had gotten to that point, so we see the concessions that Ruto has made this past week, firing the cabinet, the inspector general resigning. It's a method of self-preservation. It's like trying to pass the blame that, it's my cabinet that's inefficient, but it's him who appointed the cabinet. It's him who chairs the cabinet. So, and a lot of these members of the cabinet, when you look at them, even at the moment of their appointment, they had active cases in court, either murder cases, corruption cases, rape cases. And so their cases crumbled a few months after their appointment. And so there was nothing spectacular they could have done. It was basically a gang of the ruling class coming together and saying, okay, now we have control over the instruments of power. How do we further our gains as a small clique of people? And that is why they refused to listen to the people until this particular moment.
Thank you for all of that. So yeah, I mean, I think my next question is, you talk about this as a mass mobilization, right? As distinct from some of the other kinds of protests. I know that you and many others that you're close with are involved in different social movements. You're organizers, you're trying to figure out other ways to struggle, and so you're used to participating in protests on all sorts of issues. But as you note, like, a lot of the folks that came into the streets and made this particular moment what it was, obviously are responding to things that they're frustrated by, upset by, their own desires. But they may not be in organizations or parties or things like this. And you talk about that in the piece a little bit in terms of kind of where does this go from here? And yeah, so maybe say a little bit about that, say a little bit about, obviously this is one thing that we could say is sometimes when people protest around like financial issues, that it doesn't necessarily mean that they're deeply politicized yet, right? They know what they want to reject in terms of, their cost of living becoming unbearable, right? But it doesn't necessarily mean that they're, politically ready to elevate things to another level. So how do you see that, and how are you trying to think about where that goes from here?
I think the protests began as a moment. The protests began as a moment in that like I said in the article, when they began, they were basically a festival of freedom. People showing up and across the divide, people within organizations, people who are not part of organizations, people across ethnic divide, across political parties, and saying this doesn't work for us. And majority of them were Gen Z, the generation that's called Gen Z. I'm a millennial, but we also have to note that there were also people from other generations who also, of course, were part of the protests, either because they're part of organizations or because they're also affected by these particular issues. So we had the majority Gen Zs, we had millennials, we had people who are much older, because I think the one thing the Gen Zs were really able to do was to harness the power of mobilization, and to some of them even bring out their parents to the streets, and in many ways ask the whole country, where are you when all this is happening? And so for even people from my generation who'd never been on the streets, they then felt that, okay, now we need to be out there on the streets. It can't just be these kids talking about this and the rest of us are living our normal lives, so to say. But I think the more the protests persisted, and the more the organizations and the movements got involved, and the more information was disseminated and shared, we see a morphing of the narrative. And so we start to see questions asked about the role of the IMF in the budget setting process in Kenya. Within the protests, we start to see questions asked about imperialism and the role of Kenya in imperialism. And it must be noted that on the day when the finance bill was being debated in the Kenyan parliament, there were, I think, 8 or so, I'm not sure of the number, around 8 senators from the US who are present in the public gallery. So they were present on a day when the Kenyan parliament was meeting to discuss punitive taxes. But they've never come on a day when Kenya is meeting to discuss how do we improve healthcare, how do we improve education. And so people asked, and what are the American senators doing in the parliament, especially on this particular day? And so questions around imperialism and even the police force, which is currently in Haiti, have arisen and have gained more prominence as a result of these processes. Questions around the land question have gained more prominence because, as you know, Kenya was a settler colony, and our freedom struggle was basically fought on 2 main premises: land and freedom. The Mau Mau fought, the Kenya Land and Freedom Army fought mainly for those 2 things. At least that's the main premise of their struggle. But the land question has always remained unresolved. And so people have started asking very fundamental questions which go to the base of society and the base of the economy. Why is it that there's so many poor people and a small clique of rich people? It's like what J.M. Kariuki said in the 1970s. He was a Kenyan politician, that Kenya is a country of 10 millionaires and 10 million beggars. And I think maybe today the figures might have changed. So it might be 50 billionaires and 50 million beggars. But basically there is such high inequality across society. And these are some of the questions people have been asking. People are asking questions around the natural resources of the country and to whose service they are being put. And so I think from that initial question around taxation, a number of questions have been brought on board, which are really fundamental. And I think in any process, there has to be an entry point, and how organizations and the political processes happening in society are able to bring on board other questions and other fundamental issues affecting society is of fundamental significance. So I think in as much as the protests started around the issue of taxation, that has not been the end point of the protest, because it has morphed. And like I said earlier, people are now demanding that Ruto must go. And the people demand this knowing that Ruto is a representation of a system. And when they say Ruto must go, they are demanding for basically looking at things like the debt register and why we have to be taxed so high, and why, as I mentioned, there is inequality, the role of imperialism in this in within our reality as a people, and many other questions. They're asking questions about the access to education, the access to healthcare, employment opportunities in the country, because this government, instead of creating employment opportunities locally, has now said one of its economic pillars is labor export. I mean, in the old days, labor was exported on the basis of the enslaved people, and today, if you want to export, for example, graduates who have spent years gaining particular skills and a lot of resources being educated, and you want to export them to the Middle East to work as laborers, then you are literally condemning them to slavery. And so these are new forms of slavery, which the young people are saying, no, we do not want to go and work in other countries. We want to stay here and develop our own country. And so I think the initial demands have really escalated, and in a really good way, because they have set us back to a point where we are asking fundamental questions about society.
That's great to hear. I'm gonna share my screen for just a second, just so people can see this, because I don't think I followed this when it happened, but you talked about the senators being there, and this is just a statement for folks to understand some of the context around that. It was the 60th anniversary of, so-called U.S. Kenya relations, but and Senator Coons, Cory Booker, and Tim Scott, who are all horrible human beings. And yeah, the resolution reaffirms a U.S. Kenya strategic partnership and highlights the need for continued engagement in two-way trade and investment, defense cooperation, which I think is really the heart of it, and public health. And yeah, so anyways, I put that in the chat if people want to check it out, and the full text of it is also linked in that at the bottom of that piece, the bottom of that link. But what's interesting, right, is that obviously, as you mentioned, Haiti, this is happening, at the same time that the the US really, because there's the so-called core group with regard to Haiti, but it's essentially US, Canada, France, I think, are the primary members of this. And it's an imperial project, a US imperial project in Haiti, and Kenya is the policing arm of this right now, because obviously it looks much better for the United States if they don't have to send their own military or police to Haiti, but can, which of course is to deny Haitian sovereignty. It's not actually to try to bring stability or whatever else that they want to claim. Um, but so they get Kenya to be that partner to provide, through President Ruto, through the police force in Kenya, to provide basically the military apparatus on the ground in Haiti that looks better for the U.S. and Canada and in France than sending their own forces there to deny Haitian sovereignty. So yeah, it's interesting, those connections. It's great that people are drawing those connections in the street and seeing those questions of imperialism. That question of why is the U.S. here? What is this so-called strategic partnership, when the other part it's mentioned there is this two-way trade and investment, right? Which is, what does that actually mean, in practice for the people in Kenya? So yeah, I'm glad to see people are making those connections. Let me see if you want to say anything else on that, you can. Otherwise, I can jump to one other question too.
Please feel free to
Mhm.
go ahead.
Yeah,
Maybe,
yeah.
just briefly, I just wanted to mention that something crucial, which has also been part of the ongoing demands and questions, is the issue of food sovereignty and seed sovereignty, because the Kenyan parliament had passed a bill basically to privatize seeds and to criminalize smallholder farmers from sharing seeds, and such, so that people could rely on the Monsantos and other multinational corporations for their seeds. And it's been a really fundamental question, because the fines it outlines in that particular legislation is really punitive, especially for the peasant farmers who are the people who feed this nation. So this administration has also, in many ways, been a tool for the domination of our food supply. And trying to stifle ways through which people produce their own food. And I think there is an ongoing process before the court. Some individuals and organizations had lodged a case against that particular law. And Parliament, as the institution which passed that law, then really reneged on its role of representing the people, because if it could take away their basic right to food, which basically is what guarantees the right to existence, then it shows just how much these institutions have been co-opted and how anti-people these institutions have become. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that. All right, I do have some questions. I'll get to even questions from the chat, and if people have other ones, there's other things I'll bring up probably. But yeah, we can get some audience participation. So, Intervision Culture asks, wanted to get your perspective on what exists to build alternative economic systems. They're specifically thinking about cooperatives as a tool. I know that you all did do like a session with Kali Akuno from Cooperation Jackson last year, I believe, on thinking about cooperatives. But is that something that's being thought about within organizations as kind of alternative cooperatives or alternative ways to organize your own, economically amongst yourselves?
I think actually that's a really important question, because basically when we look at the African way of being within this particular setting, people live in very communal ways, where there's sharing, collaboration, and people come together to solve common problems or problems which affect society together. In the 1960s, immediately after Kenya's independence, there was a strong cooperative movement in this country. A lot of the crops and the produce, especially that produced farm produce, you'd find people organized into cooperatives. But the cooperative movement in Kenya was in many ways hijacked. I'm not sure if that's the best word. Actually, there might be a better word for it. Hijacked by people linked to the system, partly because of the power it had in bringing together farmers and peasants, and also because of the way in which it was able to put together the earnings of the farmers and to enable them to progress. It was hijacked, and the cooperative movement was run down. It was basically robbed of the little that it had. And it has in many ways been disintegrated. But the cooperative system still exists in many ways in parts of the country. In some parts, you'll find farmers who are organized into maybe cooperatives of dairy farmers. You'll find maybe a few coffee farmers in an area organized into a cooperative. But these cooperatives do not have the power that they historically had. There has been a resurgence, I would say, of cooperative. Sorry. There has been a resurgence of cooperative people coming together under cooperatives. And so in some areas you find farmers coming together, or in the modern day maybe a group of writers coming together to form a cooperative or something of the sort. But it still is not as strong as it was. It definitely is a strand which needs to be strengthened, which needs to be explored further, and which needs to be part of the center of our organizing, because one of the main questions which must be addressed in this society is the economic question. and cooperatives are at the heart of that question, because if we say that we are anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist, and our organizations say that they're anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist, then what alternatives are they offering, especially from below? Because there could be a lot of other offerings from the top, but with cooperatives, I think it comes from below. And there have been different organizations trying different things with different groups of people. I know Cooperation Jackson has been here last year. They gave a public lecture at the National Theatre on the experiences with cooperatives, especially in this world of where imperialism has been globalized. And I think for us, it's a question where we are still trying to explore more and more on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, thank you for that. Um, let's see. So let's see. So one of the other things, well, let's zoom out a little bit. Why don't you talk a little bit about some of the politics that the organizations that you're a part of are kind of struggling for, right? I know that you think with socialism, you think with Pan-Africanism, and so say a little bit about the work that your organizations are trying to do, and where you all are thinking about in terms of this moment and moving forward.
Like I mentioned earlier, I'm mainly part of two organizations. That is Mwamko and Kongamano la Mapinduzi. And maybe I'll first speak about Mwamko, then Kongamano la Mapinduzi. Mwamko, like I mentioned earlier, is a Pan-African popular pedagogy collective, and most of the work we do is around political education and trying to at least infuse political clarity and different political ideas into our movements, into our organizations, and so on and so forth across the continent. Mwamko, at a basic level, is anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, and anti-patriarchal. And Mwamko, what Mwamko has been doing up to this level is to focus on three main pillars in terms of the work that it is doing. One, somehow my phone keeps ringing. I don't know what's up. Hopefully, it's not interrupting on your side.
We can hear the buzzing is what we can, but it's done now. So okay, go ahead. Sorry.
So basically, Mwamko has been organizing its work around three main pillars. The first pillar is on intellectual restoration, because as African people, we recognize ourselves as bearers of knowledge. And some of the earliest known civilizations have been on the African continent. But a lot of African knowledge has been relegated to the realm of so-called myths or rumors. For example, if there is a particular African farming practice or agricultural practice and you present it in a particular place, you ask, so what is the scientific backup for it? And that is a way of diminishing other ways of knowing and being. And so we've just been trying to look at all these indigenous ways of knowing and being and trying to find their relevance in the lives we live today, whether it's agricultural practices, ways of being and sharing and whatnot. Secondly, is around economic self-determination and looking at how we can create economies from below, whether it's through cooperatives, to guarantee at least the basic dignity of our people. And lastly, looking at ecological sovereignty and how African people over the years have lived in tandem with the ecology, where they have a symbiotic relationship. Where you protect your environment and it protects you, it provides for you, and just looking at how we can especially in the current world and the raging climate crisis, the little things we can do to have a better ecology around us. But I think all in all these three pillars we work around basically are part of a wider effort to fulfill the unfinished African liberation struggle, because independence in the neo in African countries and in many countries across the world, not in all but in most of them, was basically at having a political federation, so to speak, having political independence and not really achieving economic independence. And so for us is to try and study that history and look at ways in which we can advance the struggles of those who came before us in a life affirming direction, and to see what is it that must be done by this generation, because sometimes it's also quite disheartening if it can be disheartening if we organize without clarity. And I think for us, a particular inspiration is the 1945 Congress in Manchester, because they were able to answer three fundamental questions. One, in that era, the first question was, who are our enemies? It was the colonial powers and structures behind them. The second question was, who are our friends? And it was the masses of our people. The third question was, what must be done at this particular point in time? Form the mass-based parties as instruments of organizing towards national liberation. And so for us today, in the day and age we find ourselves, I think we have to go back to those primary questions and try and see how we can move from the stalemate we find ourselves. Because living in the neo-colonial state, I think there's so many forces, both internal and external, and we have to study them and be very clear about how we want to move as people, as organizations. And speaking of organizations, as I mentioned earlier, and as you mentioned when you began, I'm also a member of Kongamano la Mapinduzi, which is a political movement in Kenya. And KLM basically brings together different groups working at community level, working on different things, whether it's political rights, economic rights, gender justice, ecological justice, into a broad-based political movement which is capable of at least moving certain agenda forward. And I think it's a young organization. It's existed for a few years now. But what it's been able to do at least is to continuously organize these communities. Secondly, to continuously engage in educational processes of political education. And thirdly, to be part of wider collectives together with other organizations, and to which is a recognition of the fact that to shift the balance of forces at this particular moment in time, all the progressive organizations have to come together. And even with regard to what is happening in Kenya at the moment, all of them have to come together and find a way of moving this process forward.
Yeah, that's great. I think it connects into kind of what I wanted to ask you next too, which is, um, is there an opening within like parliamentary elections and things like that, do you think, for progressive forces in Kenya? Is it, what is kind of your analysis of the political system, and whether that is a strategy that you know people are pursuing, and whether that makes sense to you, and that, so on.
Um, I think it's a question which has been debated among the different organizations and movements for a while now. Of course, we recognize that the elections are part of bourgeois processes, and that in many ways they are rigged even before they are held. However, they also, in some ways, one, can enable us make immediate gains, and second, can enable us gauge our strength as organizations in terms of how our ideas resonate with the masses. And they provide platforms for mobilization and education around particular ideas that we might hold, but which we might not always be able to share with the wider population in the way in which an election process enables. There are organizations which have been active on the political scene. There are, for instance, Kongamano la Mapinduzi, which I'm a member of, explicitly supported particular candidates in the last election. There are political parties like the Communist Party of Kenya, which takes part in elections, though it faced hiccups in the last election, which I'll not go into at this particular moment. But I think it's an ongoing debate, and it's a debate that's been happening. But at an overall level, if you look at the political landscape and the processes which support it in Kenya, it is rigged in favor of money. And these progressive organizations have not had, or rather do not have that money to operate effectively on that landscape. And so you find a thief is more likely to be elected than a progressive force. And the political class has learned that they can create a culture of dependency such that when they come to people with handouts, they can then influence the overall outcome of an election. And so it has been, even the progressive people taking part in the elections have really been facing difficulty. But I think over the years, especially at lower levels of representation in the county assemblies, we start seeing progressive parties and individuals having representation at those levels.
Right on. Thank you. There was a question in the chat I'll ask. Could you speak a little bit about the sentiment towards refugees in Kenya? I hope I don't mispronounce these. Dadaab, Kakuma, etc. The economic and political integration, etc.
The economic and political?
Yeah, I'm not sure entirely about what was, maybe they can add a clarification on that point, but yeah, I guess start with the refugee question.
Kenya has, I think, from the 70s or 80s, Kenya has basically had quite a large refugee population, and part of it was because up to the 80s, and I think up to the 80s, I think there's a time Kenya was described as an island of peace in a sea of turmoil, because the neighboring countries, Somalia, Ethiopia, Sudan at that time, we now border South Sudan, and Uganda, were all in various kinds of armed conflict. It's only, I think, Tanzania, which is to the south, which was more or less. Tanzania has always been very peaceful, much more peaceful than even Kenya itself, and so there was a lot of people running away from conflict and the harm that the conflict had brought upon them, and the interruptions of their lives, and into Kenya from these neighboring countries. And so the Kenyan government initially set up refugee camps, and a lot of them were confined within those refugee camps. Over the years, maybe some of them moved onwards to other countries, or some found their way into other parts of Kenya outside of the refugee camps. But a greater majority of them, especially for those who are poor, remained within the refugee camps, where the conditions are deplorable. And those who are able to leave the refugee camps, most of the time were able to leave either on humanitarian grounds or because they were of a higher economic standing and could then maneuver their way into the cities and whatnot. But I think over the past years, the Kenyan government, especially the first 5 years or so, 10 years or so, especially the previous administration, had at various moments threatened to close the refugee camps, because the refugee camps to date still host millions of people. I'm not sure of the exact numbers, but I know maybe in totality could be between 500,000 to 1 million people. I'm not sure of the figures, who are still in those refugee camps, especially Kakuma, Dadaab, and whatnot. They could actually even be much higher. The Kenyan government had threatened to close them, but I think the Kenyan government did not threaten to close them out of because of a legitimate reason. It was, in my opinion, part of the way of coercing the UNHCR, United Nations High Commission of Refugees, to channel the resources through the government. I think most of the time it's always the battle for resources and who controls them and who can manipulate how the resources move. That whole discourse is not around the interests of the refugees or whoever, but the resources around that particular area.
Yeah, thank you. And it sounded like the person who asked the question was questioning, the economic and political integration question was sort of about, are they dependent upon NGOs still? And, I know that you all have thought a lot about the role of NGOs in Africa. Maybe you could say a little bit about that too, for folks who may have missed that conversation, just in terms of, some of the ways that NGOs impact the landscape in Kenya, and serve as, I think you would probably say, as a part of imperialism really in Kenya. And maybe, a little bit about that, about the ways that imperialism structures your reality.
Just before I think that's a really important question. And just before I get into it, maybe just to answer the question, because I saw it more clearly. I think in many ways, those in the camps, our brothers and sisters in the camps, still depend on the NGOs, especially for provision of basic services like food, water, and even education. And many other services, because the UN agencies are themselves overwhelmed. The government Kenyan government provides very minimal input, and so the NGOs in that sense have stepped in to fill a void. But thinking of NGOs in the overall landscape in Kenya, I think it's a question which has been debated, and which is what informed our first appearance on the show, and it was a really interesting discussion. And we cannot look at NGOs in isolation in terms of what they're doing in society. We have to go back in history and look at their emergence, especially on the African political landscape. And so NGOs in Africa, which Issa Shivji, who is a leading thinker and Pan-Africanist, professor of law at the University of Dar es Salaam, he wrote this pamphlet, I think in the late 90s or early 2000s, titled Silences of NGOs in Africa. And Shivji basically did an analysis and said, NGOs appear in Africa in the form in which they exist today in the 80s, which is the era of the structural adjustment programs. And so the structural adjustment programs basically forced a retreat of the state from the provision of essential services, whether it was education, whether it was healthcare, whether it was housing and whatnot and whatnot. And these NGOs then appear and to fill that void. They then appear to fill that void. And so in filling that void, for example, providing education or healthcare, setting up hospitals or schools, they then take away the responsibility of providing these things from the state, and the people then are also able to get these services and do not demand from the state what it needs to provide. The problem with the NGOs is that they exist within a framework which can one day just wake up and fold and say, we think we are leaving, while the state, at least we are here with it. We can negotiate and push things around like Kenyan people are doing at the moment. And so in many ways, the ways NGOs were operating in the country and the ways in which they're operating in Kenya and beyond Kenya in many places is that they act as a soft arm of imperialism, because they are able to influence political discourse, especially the politically inclined ones. They are able to influence political thought. They're even able to, in many ways, because they are the ones with the resources to do massive civic education across the country. They're able to influence how people regard and interpret the political frameworks within the country. And in an electoral system like this, it even can translate into how people vote. And so NGOs have been used by various forces to achieve various interests. And for us who come from the organizations, the one thing we know, we cannot compete with the NGOs from the political organizations within the country is the realm of resources, which, like I mentioned last time, when Nyerere wrote the Arusha Declaration, he said, a poor person does not use money as a weapon. If we decide to compete on them on that realm, we then would have chosen the wrong weapon for our struggle. We can only compete on them at the level of the battle of ideas, and which ideas are most progressive for our people, and which ideas could lead to the creation of societies that guarantee the dignity of our people. And that is not to say that I have to give a disclaimer that all NGOs are a soft arm of imperialism. Of course, there exist progressive NGOs. There also exist progressive individuals within that whole NGO landscape. But looking at it in totality, they basically are a negation of the kind of society we would love to have. Because if an NGO provides me with education, yet I pay taxes, it means that there is people somewhere who enjoy my taxes, who eat my taxes, and instead of providing education, sit by and watch as the NGO provides education. If the NGO provides me even with water, then it then raises fundamental questions. And a lot of these NGOs are also funded either from outside the country, meaning if that funding dries up, then and they're the ones providing my fundamental needs, I'm in a very dire situation. For instance, if funding for the water I drink dies up, then I'm in a very dire situation. And so, especially for these essential services, the insistence has to be that the government, which is elected by the people and which collects taxes to provide these services, should provide them.
Yeah, thank you for that, Sungu. So I want to kind of, maybe we can kind of start to move to a close on this note. And then if there's anything else you want to add, you can. And if the audience has any final questions, feel free to get them in. But you mentioned climate change earlier in the discussion, and I know we had posted a conversation with some of the other folks who were involved in the Organic Intellectuals network recently, that was kind of about, we talked about Haiti, we talked about Palestine, and anyways, right as we kind of went to publish it, there was an incredible amount of flooding that was hitting Kenya, and specifically Madare, and the kind of there's these large informal settlements in Kenya too, and I think that people in the United States and other parts of the world may not really know that much about what that means, and kind of what that reality is like. And I know that there was also a lot of like demolitions or clearing of settlements, and I think you might have referenced that earlier. So could you talk a little bit about those aspects? I mean, just how climate change is impacting Kenya at this point, and the informal settlements and the problem of like housing and land again.
Uh, uh, I think that's a really fundamental question because scientists are saying that we live in the age of the Anthropocene, which is, or rather, we live in the Anthropocene, the age that human activity has had the greatest impact on the planet. And and in Kenya, I think, and much of the global south, in as much as the contribution to net emissions and everything is minimal, I think we have borne the greatest impact of changing climatic conditions. And it's true, like you say, just two or 3 months ago, there was massive flooding across Kenya, massive flooding. That level of rain I haven't witnessed in a long time, in a really long. Actually, I don't think I've ever witnessed it. Continuous flooding, continuous rain, and just more rain and more rain, and. In many parts of the country, a lot of people lost their lives. I think the death toll the death toll is in the hundreds from the recent floods in Kenya alone. And for me, what was most shocking was the response of the government, which is part of the contributing factors to the ongoing protests, because what the government basically did after, first of all, the government did not prepare for the floods, though they had been predicted. So it is a case of negligence, because these floods had been predicted by the Meteorological Department, which is a government department. The executive arm of government came and said, no, you are misleading the public. There is not going to be that much rain. So these people revised their figures now after having initially announced that there's going to be like a lot of rainfall and we need to start preparing. But now, because the politicians who are not scientists came into now with their religious voodoo and said, now we've held prayers. Now, now we'll only have enhanced rainfall. I mean, it's something really crazy. But when it rained, and those rains claimed lives, apart from that initial act of negligence, the government was also slow to respond to the crisis. The crisis continued to compound itself without an adequate response mechanism from government. And at the end of the day, in an area like Madare, you had on the, I think, second or third night of the rains, just a massive wall of water came and literally carried people and houses with it. And I think over 40 people were just cleared in a span of a few minutes, like dead, gone, finished. And so we see how government then responds to this. But then what is Madare? Madare is the oldest people settlement in Nairobi, the so-called slum. If you read government documents, they call them informal settlements. But a settlement, to say that a settlement is informal is a fallacy, because that is to informalize the people who live there. It is that settlement exists because out of a failure of the government to provide housing to the people. And so when people died in these floods, the government said there's people who have built houses on riparian reserves and waterways and whatnot. So we are going to carry out a demolition exercise. The biggest contradiction, however, was that the only demolitions which were done were in these settlements that have been informalized by the government, while in the middle class and rich areas of Nairobi, no demolitions were done. While the greatest number of riparian reserves are in these rich areas where people have built personal dams or houses, on whatnot, on what should be wetlands and sinkholes for water. And that is where the political class also lives. So they did a cosmetic exercise downstream, and in the process made hundreds of thousands of people in Madare and other settlements that have been informalized homeless. And this is 3 months ago, which is why when we began, I said the current protests are something which have been coming. It is the culmination of many things which have slowly but surely been building up, because this regime has been very callous about how it handles issues which are really are about the lives of the people, really are about how the people live and sleep at the most basic level. And it's really funny, because this is a government which has modeled itself around climate change, and even the African Climate Change Summit was held in Nairobi. But their version of climate change is one which does not address the root issues. It looks at issues around carbon trade, which allow the global north to continue polluting, while in Kenya and other parts of the global south, we are told plant trees and trade this. We are like, no, 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 that doesn't make sense to us. We really need to have an honest conversation. And so for them, they are really thinking about how to make money off the forests we have in the country, and declare them carbon sinkholes and whatnot. And for them, it's climate change is just another economic a project. And so for me, I think we really need to, when it comes to climate change, address the fundamental questions which are at the heart of climate change. One, who is doing the polluting? Second, are there frameworks for climate reparations, if they can happen, if we can arrive at that framework? And third, how do we deploy cleaner and more efficient sources of energy and sustainable ways of consumption, at least at the most basic level? Kenya is a country which, because now people are talking about renewable energy and green energy. When I was growing up, I knew we produced maybe 80% of our electricity from hydro, from the dams. And this country has a lot of sun you can produce from solar. But in this day and age, we are now producing, that's just maybe 2 decades ago or something. Today, we are producing it from diesel. So while the world is moving to more friendly things, we are now moving to fossil fuel. And the reason we are moving to fossil fuel is because that then makes it easier to introduce public-private partnerships and corporations in the production process, because the local bourgeoisie doesn't have the capital, for example, to build a huge dam and use it to produce, but they can build a diesel power station. So it also shows the ways in which we basically are regressing, but at the same time are entrenching ourselves in the middle of the climate change conversation as a country, and claiming to have taken a very progressive position and become champions of climate change. Hopefully, I answered your question. I think now I'm just going on and on and on.
No, 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 no. It's all good. Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, I know that I need to let you go in a few minutes. Is there anything else that you wanted to share with folks? You know, I guess one last question. Maybe we could close on this, unless there's anything else that you wanted to share. But I was thinking about in your piece how you do write about Gen Z, right? And you talked about the discourse about Gen Z, and it's an interesting thing in the U.S. too. We've also had Gen Z movements recently. The campus protests in solidarity with Palestine were, of course, primarily led by folks from this generation. So, I'm going to ask kind of a weird question, because honestly, usually I try not to think in kind of generational terms so much, but despite the name of this podcast. But, I think that there's maybe there's lessons or things that you saw from the way that Gen Z was organizing that you would say that you would want to learn from, or you think movements need to adopt or take seriously in Kenya. And then there's probably the inverse, right? Which are things that you think movements and organizations might bring to the conversation and future struggles, that maybe Gen Z needs to listen to a little bit.
I think when the protests began in Kenya, and probably it's been the same with what's happening in other places, is that people asked, and I think I mentioned it in the article. People asked, "Who are all these kids, and what's really going on here?" But the so-called kids were raising a very legitimate question. In the same way that even with the occupations that have been happening in the States, there are around very legitimate questions and questions around humanity. Probably the most important questions of our time are being raised by this generation. And I think it's important, I think, for the rest of society to recognize that no generation grows within a vacuum or grows up within a vacuum. The generation grows within material reality, and it grows within the larger society. And in as much as they might be younger than other people in society, it's not to mean that they do not see and hear what is not happening in society. Actually, the thing is that they probably are the most unseen and unheard segment of society, because people think of them as young, dumb, entitled, and many other stereotypes that we might have attached to them, either knowingly or unknowingly. But as Fanon said in the 60s, each generation has a responsibility. It must either fulfill it or betray it. And I think Gen Z, in many ways, are fulfilling their responsibilities to society, and especially their historical responsibility. In the Kenyan context, I think one of the greatest learnings for the organizations and movements is and it's something which has been known for a while. Basically, it's the power of the internet and how it can be used to galvanize people and mobilize people in a very short period of time around a singular issue. And I think a lot of the organizations and movements at the beginning were taken aback by the rapid way in which mobilizations could happen and information could be disseminated, and they were in many ways struggling to catch up. But we know that sometimes the masses can be ahead of the organizations, and sometimes the organizations can be ahead of the masses. The thing is to figure out how the organizations and the masses can move together in tandem. In Kenya, we've seen the use of the internet, even the use of AI to create nodes on the internet where someone can easily go and get particular information, either about a certain politician or about a certain process or about a certain number of laws and all these things in a way which is easily accessible and easy to disseminate. And I think it's something that even the organizations can learn from. I think for the Gen Z, I think the only, and I would not want to use the word advice. I was tempted to use it. Maybe the only thing I could say is that perhaps it would also be good to think of the power of organization. Us being part of organizations and movements, and having clear goals, clear political goals and political programs. For instance, as is happening right now with organizations coming together to have a minimum list of demands and a minimum program which at least they want fulfilled within this process, because that then helps us channel our energies to particular things and to know where we are making progress and where we are held back, and to put our minds together and to strategize on how to move every brick that makes the larger house move it forward. And so I think learning is a two-way process. The organizations and movements, like you said, have a lot to learn from Gen Z. The Gen Z also have probably a lot to learn from the organizations, especially from the political education that the organizations are doing, the collective processes of conscientization within society, which have been ongoing before the protests and even during the protests. And so I think it should be a mutual exchange between people and organizations. But I think it's really important that we are part of organizations, progressive
Awesome.
organizations, not just organizations, because there's also backward organizations. Actually, let me, in a few years ago, there was even an organization here called MAWE, which was an acronym for Men Against Women Empowerment. So that is a very backward organization. So we can't just say you need to be part of an organization, but it must be progressive.
That's a great point. Absolutely. Not all organizations are equal. Sungu, Oyoo, thank you so much for this conversation. It's been, incredibly enlightening. I know I learned a lot. I'm sure the audience did as well. Um, yeah, thanks again for joining me. And I hope that we can keep up the dialogue and have future conversations as well. And thanks to everybody also who tuned in and joined in the chat. I did add a couple of links in the chat if people want to check out Mwamko or Congo Mong Panduzi. Sorry, I know I messed that up. Yes, yes. I put links to those in the chat as well as to um, Sungu's Twitter account, or Twitter X if people want to connect there as well. And so I know that there are people who would be interested, people in organizations that want to make connections, and I know that's one of the things when we've talked to you all before about ways that people can help. Or support in the United States, it's to organize ourselves, right, and then also to connect and see if there are points where collaborations can happen and things like that. So, anyways, thanks again. This has been great.
Thank you, Jared, and many thanks for the invite to the show.
Yeah, it was a pleasure for sure.